Hello everyone! If you've clicked on this video, you probably want to learn a thing or two about wind turbines. But I'm going to be assuming you're a busy person. In fact, every second you spend watching this video could be time spent doom scrolling on your phone. So we're going to keep things nice and short, at 10 minutes or less. And within that time frame, I'm going to explain to you everything you need to know about wind turbines. How they work, what their advantages are, what their disadvantages are, and finally, what their future looks like. You'll learn why wind is growing exponentially, and why the International Energy Agency projects that wind capacity is going to double in the next 5 years to nearly 2,000 gigawatts worth of capacity, or enough to power 1.6 billion homes. As you can imagine, if we're fitting everything in 10 minutes or less, we're gonna have to stick to the essentials. So any context that I've removed for time is gonna show up in these green boxes. So pause the video if you wanna watch those. And if you want, I made my first video on this series about solar panels. So if I figure out how YouTube does that whole little click thing, you can probably click it here. And of course, if you want to follow along, make sure to subscribe. And with that said, my name is Matthew, my self-worth is overly tied to those two pieces of paper, and you're watching Carbon Anonymous. So humans have been harnessing the power of wind for a very long time. It just hasn't been for generating electricity. Like, for example, on boats, where we harnessed wind to help us cross vast oceans to see continents never seen before by man. Or we've used them to help us do tasks that are too much work for ourselves and our donkeys, like windmills. Windmills were historically used to grind up grain into flour, and is actually where the term comes from, because a mill is where you grind grain, and if that's powered by wind, you therefore have a wind mill. But this video isn't about windmills, it's about wind turbines, which specifically turn the kinetic energy of wind into usable electricity. And the first one was invented by a Scotsman named James Blythe in 1887. But, along with every other renewable technology like solar panels and EVs that were invented in the late 1800s, they were just slightly more impractical and much more expensive than their fossil fuel counterparts, so they were thrown to the side, never to be looked at again. Well, until the 1970s, when we realized that those same fossil fuels were turning up the temperature on this planet. So we dusted off those old technologies in hopes that they could help solve our energy issues. And wind turbines were one of those technologies that we hope can help us replace some of our coal and natural gas plants to generate carbon-free electricity. But it's even more important now, as we start to electrify other things like transportation and home heating. It's super important that our electricity is carbon-free, because if your Tesla is running off of electricity generated from coal, that's not necessarily carbon neutral. So generating cheap renewable energy is paramount for solving climate change. And the good thing is, wind is definitely renewable. But is it cheap? As with most things in life, it always just comes back to money, and wind energy in the 1970s was really expensive, so that held it back. However, we've made it a long way, and wind electricity right now is actually one of the cheapest sources of electricity in the world. And this was arguably inevitable, because one of the advantages of wind is that wind is free. So other than the costs associated with construction and maintenance, as long as the wind is blowing, you're generating free electricity. This stands in contrast to other sources like nuclear or coal, which have to pay for their fuel on top of their maintenance and construction costs. So how do we go from expensive to cheap? Well, we took advantage of two phenomenons, known as economies of scale and the learning effect. And economies of scale refers to the cost advantage you achieve by increasing the scale of production. Essentially, it's always cheaper to produce a lot of things than it is to produce a few things. Then you have the learning effect, which describes the cost reductions you can achieve when you're building thousands of turbines, because you essentially learn as you go, right? You solve manufacturing issues, you come up with better designs. Essentially, every wind turbine you build is a chance to improve your craft. However, if there's one technical thing that we've done to make wind turbines better, it is most certainly their gigantification, because these things are absolutely huge now. And we've gone through this gigantification for a couple of reasons. First off, the bigger your wind turbines are, the longer the blades can be, which means they're going to capture more wind and generate more electricity. Secondly, if they're bigger, they're also taller, and there's usually much more wind higher up than there is lower to the ground, which allows you to generate even more electricity. However, this gigantification has limitations. Those blades that I talked about that are now nearly the size of a football field, well, they're usually made to be one piece because they need to be super strong. And this creates some pretty comical pictures of trucks trying to haul these things around. And as funny as those things are to look at, this creates issues. Very recently, we had a wind turbine, or at least the base of it, getting caught underneath a bridge down in Australia. So it's fair to say there may be a cap to how big we can make wind turbines on land, which is why the industry has shifted towards offshore wind to help with its gigantification process. And although you can generate more electricity, it has its own sets of issues. Principal among them being the fact that you are in the ocean, and that's a pretty difficult thing to figure out. But we've been talking about how great wind is for most of this video, and it's time to let the other foot drop and start talking about its disadvantages, because wind energy is by no means perfect. So wind has actually quite a few haters, and one of them is actually Donald Trump.
Kills all the birds, it's very intermittent.
You know what it is? I want to be a whale psychiatrist. It drives the whales freaking crazy. And something happens with them.
This has accumulated in some pretty severe measures, and he's even gone as far as signing an executive order pausing all federal leases for offshore wind. This is a difficult conversation to have because wind has some genuine issues. And then it also has some issues that are completely fabricated. So to be as fair as possible, I'm going to introduce the BS to legit meter so we can explore which issues are actually problematic and which ones are just misinformation. Let's start off on the BS end of the spectrum with how wind farms are affecting whales. And this connection is already flimsy to start off with, and there's literally no evidence to show that it is true. And even if it were, what about the millions of other non-wind turbines there are? But Matthew, what wind turbines do you speak of? Oh, my bad, let me call them by their real name. Like propellers? You know, those little things on boats that go spin and have actually been shown to strike whales? They're a problem too. So unless you're wanting to ban all boats, banning wind farms for affecting whales seems completely arbitrary. But what about the birds? Well, this one's actually based in reality, and wind farms do smack quite a few birds. But again, when we compare it to other sources of mortality, it's a drop in the bucket. This graph shows what things that humans have done that kill birds, and you can see that cats are by far the worst, and we have wind turbines being at the end of the scale. However, this graph is misleading because it is logarithmic, and when we change it to actually measure 1-to-1, you'll see that wind turbines fit within the rounding error of other mortality sources. So suffice to say, unless you're willing to give up on all cats, complaining about wind turbines again seems pretty arbitrary. Moving up on the scale, we have recycling. Like I mentioned before, these wind turbine blades are composite material, which is very expensive to recycle. So most of them actually just end up going to landfill, which is where these ugly pictures come from. And it really is bad PR to have your eco-friendly technology end up in a landfill. So a lot of companies are researching how to make more recyclable wind turbine blades. Next up, we have what I just referred to as the location issue. And one of the problems for wind is that not all the wind is happening where the people are. So you do have to build some of these wind farms in locations that are far away from cities and not necessarily easily accessible. Furthermore, you sometimes have issues where people just don't like having them around. They think they're ugly, they're upset about the noise. So finding locations for wind turbines is actually not as easy as you would think. The last issue is the biggest, and I alluded to it earlier. As long as the wind is blowing, you're generating free electricity. So this begs the question, what do you do when there is no wind? And this issue is usually referred to as the intermittency problem. And it hasn't been an issue because wind has historically generated a small portion of the world's electricity, but some countries are really starting to get up there And the UK is a good example because they generate nearly a third of the electricity from wind now. However, the UK has had to invest in solutions to intermittency, which have historically been peaker plants, which are these natural gas generators that are designed to rapidly accelerate when needed. Essentially, when wind dies off, they'll quickly accelerate to generate the electricity in the meantime. Luckily for us, battery energy storage is quickly becoming a good alternative to peaker plants, and is a technology that is basically a massive battery and will help solve intermittency by basically storing wind energy when it's overabundant and releasing it when it's scarce. So with all of these problems addressed, we can clearly see that wind isn't a perfect source of energy and does have some legit issues to it, even though the BS ones tend to get more airtime. So where does that leave us, and what does the future of wind look like? Like I said at the start, everything really does just come back to the money, and although wind has its problems, which we've explored, it really is just too cheap to say no to at this point, and is why the IEA still projects that within 5 years' time, we're still going to see a doubling of wind capacity, and that when combined with solar, nearly 30% of all the world's electricity is going to be coming from renewable sources. Boom, nailed it. That is everything you need to know about wind turbines in 10 minutes or less. If I've missed anything, put it in the comments below. And if you want to hear more climate change solutions and the quick 10-minute summaries of them, make sure you subscribe. Lastly, my name is Matthew. You've been watching Carbon Anonymous, and thank you for watching.